Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. So today I'm going to be talking about the Old Meran variation in the Semi-Slav. I've used a few resources. First one is the series by Jonathan Schrantz on the St. Louis Chess Club YouTube channel. That's a really good series, quite old but still very good, explains the main thematic ideas and possible variations that could arise from there. But I think I found some improvements and some concrete lines. Also, I've used this book, as I've preached before in the past, the Meran Semi-Slav by Reynold, and I've used, obviously, Stockfish 15 to analyze the variations and try to come up with the best solutions for black and try to give my overall impression on the variations that we could choose from. So, we're just going to enter the main position here into the Meran after e3, knight bd7, bishop d3, and then we take on c4 to gain a tempo on the bishop, and then b5, bishop d3, and then a6 here. So a6 denotes the Old Meran, and it's the most direct move to try to play for c5 immediately. And if we, for example, play bishop b7 in the previous move, which is known as the Modern Meran, then c5 wouldn't be an immediate threat because the b5 pawn would be hanging. Obviously, bishop e7 is completely fine and the preference of most players actually. But after this variation, which is the Old Meran, we're going to talk about a few of the options from this position. So we're immediately threatening c5 here to challenge white's center, and if white plays a careless move here like castles, then this actually just, I think, equalizes for black, or it gives black a very nice position, and I think black's chances are quite good here to play for the win. The reason that we don't want to play b4 here, which looks very tempting, you just want to kick the knight away, and then you could play c5 later, right? The problem is that after knight e4 and then c5, white has this really annoying move queen a4, which first off pins the knight. So now there's already an immediate threat of knight takes c5 or even d takes c5. And after, for example, bishop b7, knight c5, white is already a lot better. So this queen a4 move is quite annoying. And so we just play the immediate c5, which is very natural. And in this position, queen e2 is quite possible, freeing up the d1 square for the rook. But this variation is quite harmless, I think. If white ever plays e4, then we can at least take on d4, and then at some point maybe plant a knight on c5 to harass the bishop. And essentially, whenever white pushes the e4 pawn forward, then after taking on d4, all of the dark squares, namely e5 and d4, will be extremely weak and a very nice place for like the knights to jump in, or even like the bishop to jump into c5. So after bishop e7 here, which is quite natural, a move like e4 here would just lead to kind of exactly what black wants. We take on d4, and then we play bishop d6 here. Knight c5 looks very tempting, but there's actually the point of queen e2 here is revealed, which is the move rook d1. And if we take on d4, then there's going to be bishop e5 check, just winning the queen. So this gives white some counterplay, so we just play bishop d6. And after bishop g5, we can castle, get the king out of danger, rook a1, and then b4. There's no really good square for the knight here, so let's just say knight a4, and we can immediately attack both pieces with queen e5, attacking the bishop on g5 and the knight on a4. And the knight on a4 is quite misplaced, as we will see frequently in this variation. So after bishop f6, knight f6, b3, rook a d8, knight f3, and we play bishop e8 here. Bishop e8 just secures the bishop, as there was already the threat of e5 with a fork on the previous position. Actually, maybe not, because there's bishop f3 and then takes on e5, but still, the bishop is quite nice here. It's quite safe. And at some point, black can even consider like a move like knight g4 to control the dark squares, or even maybe knight h5 to f4. Also, bishop a7 is an idea to put pressure on the f2 pawn. I think bishop a7 is a very universal idea in this variation, which is why we're going to go back here. And so e4 is clearly not the move. D takes e5 allows the bishop to develop with tempo. But the reasoning is that white wants to say that after e4, the knight is not forced to come to d4, like in the previous variation. And so here, there's a really nice move, queen b8, just controlling the e5 square. And if ever white pushes the pawn to e5, then we have this beautiful square for the knight on d5. So after bishop g5, we castle, rook ac1, and then h6, just harassing the bishop. And after bishop h4, we have this move knight h5, threatening the move knight f4 to win the bishop. And after bishop e1, just getting the bishop out of danger. Bishop b6 is a really nice move to prepare, just getting out of the c file and then preparing knight e5 to take more control over the dark squares, which white has voluntarily weakened. Also note that white cannot play e5 because there's bishop f3 and queen e5. So this gives black a very pleasant advantage here. The bishops are also very nice on these diagonals, and the bishop maybe on b1 hasn't been opened up yet. So this is very nice for black. So going back, d takes c5 isn't very challenging because it gives a free tempo for the bishop. But rook d1 is possibly the most logical move because queen e2, rook d1 is just the main idea of getting the queen out of the d file. And the only problem here for white is that the c1 bishop is quite bad, and black also needs to activate this f8 bishop. So it's best for black here not to capture on d4, just maintain the tension, because if white captures on c5, then the piece is going to come to c5 and it's going to control more of the dark squares. So here, queen b8 is a very nice move. Similar to the previous variation, the queen is just better on b8 here to control the long diagonal. And a move like e4 here is already not very good because we can take on d4 like usual. After knight d4, we play bishop d6. We have a tempo on h2 here, and we control the important dark squares, namely e5 and f4. So this looks already very good for black, and we can see sample continuation here after h3, castles, and the bishop g5. Note that bishop e3 here is not very good because you would just lose a pawn after b4, knight e4, and then we just take on e4 here. So bishop e3 cannot be played, and so bishop g5 here. And here I think the best move is to play h6. And after bishop f6, this is quite a big concession because if black retreats to h4, then we can play g5, and then the bishop will have to retreat and white will lose a pawn. And meanwhile at bishop e3, this would be better than like the text move in the game in the book that I just mentioned by Reynold. The idea is that white has essentially provoked black to play h6, and so maybe this can be weakness in the future. But still, I think that after bishop h2, misplacing the king ever so slightly, and king h1, we have this move bishop f4, which takes control of the dark squares and removes any threat of like any sacrifices on h6 in the future. And I think black should be slightly better here. This bishop f4 idea, along with the queen b8, queen on b8, is quite thematic. So I think this is something you need to remember. And here bishop f6 was actually chosen in the game, and after knight f6, a4 was chosen. But after b4, knight b1, I want to show this game for just a bit because it's really instructive. Knight b1 just is a typical move. You want to bring the knight to d2 to c4, and if white is given like 2 tempi, then for free, then black is in quite some trouble. But we have the move rook d8 here, just gaining control over the d file. Knight f3, because we were threatening bishop h2 to win the knight. So knight f3, and then we take on e4 because there's a nice tactic here, which is possibly why knight a2 was better than knight b1 in this game. After bishop e4, queen e4 would just lose after bishop h2, takes here, and the queen d8 here, with rook c8, rook c to c1, and white is completely paralyzed here. So that's quite easy. But after rook d6, just giving back the winning some material actually. But after this sequence and rook d1, we get a similar situation as we just saw before, with the rook coming to c8 and a c1. And after here, a5, b3, queen c8 was a nice final move, threatening queen a6, and white saw nothing better to do than resign. So that's a very nice game, showing the dangers of the position. So yeah. So e4 is not very challenging. h3 is possibly a better move, just making a useful move to maintain the tension and stuff. But after, I think bishop d6, very calm development. Black should still be slightly better with castles. And then you can bring the rook to d8 and use the similar themes in the shown in the previous variation. So queen e2 has an idea of bringing the rook to d1, but we can just play bishop e7, possibly queen b8, getting the queen out of the d file, and black is completely fine. And a4 here is quite possible, just challenging the queen side. But here we can play b4, and after knight e4, play bishop e7 with the tempo. And here a couple of moves can be played. Knight g3 is no good actually, because we can play the thematic h5 move, as we see in many positions when the knight is on g3 and black has not castled, then this move is quite strong. After h4, this prevents black from pushing h4, but destabilizes the knight on g3. So we can just play bishop d6, and it's clearly obvious that the knight on g3 is misplaced and will be taken next with a big advantage. So for example, knight g5 is what the computer recommends. Bad for takes, and queen c7. Black clearly has a big advantage because of this weak pawn. So going back, instead of knight g3, knight e to d2 is interesting, preparing knight c4. But here we can just continue with bishop e7, because knight c4 would get a tempo on the bishop if it was on d6. So bishop e7, queen e2 and castles, rook d1, and then a5 here, just preventing white from pushing a5 and and just supporting the b4 pawn. After knight c4, we take on d4, e4, and then knight b6 here, and we get a typical position, actually a very favorable version of the isolated queen's pawn, because black has successfully managed to blockade it with 3 pieces, actually 4 pieces, both of the knights, the bishop on b7, and the queen on d8. So the d4 pawn will remain a weakness, and I think black has a very pleasant advantage here. And instead of knight e d2, knight f6 is the main move here. And in previous games, knight f6 seems to be the most common move. But I found that after d takes c5, the fact that the knight is no longer on d7 means that white can take on c5 here, and after bishop c5, queen e2, there's already the threat of rook d1 in this position. So best here is to play queen d5 to prevent first off e4, and also preparing to swing the queen over. And after rook d1, queen h5, I think that white has a very nice advantage here after e4. And if we play a move like knight g4 here, trying to attack the f2 pawn, white has the brilliant bishop d5 check here. Because if we take here, then I think just queen takes. Yeah, queen takes here, and then the bishop on b7 hangs. So that is quite obvious. But after king f8, rook d7, the rook activity here is clearly benefiting only white. After this sequence, for example, king f1 is a nice move, and here white is completely winning. So after e4, castles here is best, and after h3, rook f d8, bishop f4, it's clear to see that white has a pleasant advantage because of the extra space. The strong bishop on f4, and targeting the a6 pawn with both the queen and the bishop. So at some point this pawn can fall if black is not careful. So this is the reason that this line with knight takes f6 is not so good, which is why queen takes f6 is preferable, keeping the knight on d7 to take on c5 at any moment. It's less popular, but I think it's best. And after rook e1, we play h6, preventing any e4 and bishop g5, which would actually trap the queen. After b3, c takes d4, good moment to take on d4, because now, white didn't manage to get the bishop on b2. Because if we were to play it like a slow move, then bishop b2 would just put some unpleasant pressure on the diagonal. So cd4, ed4, and then bishop d6 here with a very comfortable position. And a sample game that I just want to show is bishop e2 and then take on f3. And this endgame, black has a better structure here, clearly, with doubled pawns here and an isolated d4 pawn. But white has a bishop pair. But in this specific situation, the fact that the isolated pawn and there's also this backward pawn on b3, it gives black a big advantage after knight f6, preventing any d5 pushes. And after bishop e4, knight e4, fe4, this position is actually very good for black, namely because after rook c8, there's no good way to push these pawns without it being more of a weakness. So after the game, rook e2, bishop f4, king g2, king e7, h4, g5, d5, e5, just closing up the position here. And after king h3, gh4, rook g1. Rook c5 was played in the game, but rook hg8 is just a very nice way to simplify the position. And rook g1 with a completely dominant position here. Which is why queen takes f6 is best in that position, keeping the knight on d7. So yeah, that essentially covers this move a4. And so this entire castle's early castle's move is no good, as we saw before, because we can play the immediate c5. We can talk about a few moves here. For example, queen c2. Okay, it's not really challenging. I mean, we can just break with c5. I think it's. I'm not sure if we actually need any more theory here. Yeah, further than this position, because it's quite obvious that black manages to get in c5 without any serious problems. A4 here is quite critical because now we don't get in the immediate c5 because now the b5 pawn hangs. And this was supported by Viktor Korchnoi, and it leads to an interesting strategic struggle where both sides will have weaknesses, but I think that if we know the typical maneuvers in this position, then black shouldn't be any worse. Here, bishop b7 is more solid, but before this attacks the knight and gains a tempo, but it weakens the c4 square this early on, which is why I think after knight e4, c5, knight f6, knight f6, and then yeah, we get this similar position. I think queen f6 here is possibly better with a similar. Yeah, similar to the previous variation, but yeah, maybe even after e4, black is under some pressure because we cannot take on d4 now on account of bishop g5 just harassing the queen. So this is not very good. So that's the entire reason that bishop e7 is just a preferable move. And after castles and b4, now black is ready to push b4 because the bishop is already on b7, and after, let's say, knight e4, there's c5, and now yeah, white has to do something with the knight. Instead of knight e4, knight b1 is interesting. Try to head to c4 via d2, so here. And there are ideas here, like for example, if white can push the pawn to a5, isolating the b4 pawn and also the a6 pawn, and then yeah, and getting that sort of setup, then we might be in some trouble. But we can play c5 here, and then for knight b d2, we play bishop d6. So this is an interesting idea that some grandmasters like Kramnik and Bachmann, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, sorry, have tried. The idea is to bring the bishop at some point back to c7, where it can control the b6 square and also control e5. So also when the queen goes to b8, yeah, there will be pressure along this diagonal, as we saw in the one of the previous variations. Yeah, I think Stockfish assesses bishop e7 and bishop d6 as equal, but bishop d6 is, I think, a preferable human move. After queen e2, we play queen b8 here, and there's some pressure on h2 in this point, but yeah, another idea in this position is to bring the bishop to c6 or d5, mainly c6, because if we bring it to d5, then e4 may come. But with the bishop on c6, we can play queen b7x and put pressure on the long diagonal, which is an interesting idea here. Knight c4, bishop c7, h3, castles, a5, and then knight e4, which completely prevents the e4 push. And after rook d1, rook d8, we are following a Gelfand versus Kramnik game here. Bishop d2, putting some pressure on the b4 pawn. We play bishop d5, defending the pawn, and also preparing queen b7 at this moment. After bishop e1, queen b7, black has achieved the ideal setup here, and white is quite passive in this position, so I think black has a nice position. Yeah, I think Gelfand here agreed to the draw because the position is objectively balanced, but black has clearly no problems here. So going back to this position, instead of knight b1, knight e4 is the main move, and we can play the immediate c5. If white plays a move like knight ed2, trying to head to c4, then this will just transpose into the variation that we saw before, because bishop b6 and the queen b8, as we saw before. So knight f6 here, and then knight f6, bc5, bishop c5, queen e2, and then we play queen d5 here. It transposes, so Possibly here better is just maybe queen f6 and getting to the other variation with rook e1 and we saw before. So I don't know why I have knight f6 there as the main variation. Queen f6 is clearly preferable. And after e4 h6, I think the fact that the bishop is already in b7 means that black has prevents any possible e4 and the d5 pushes in the future. So this position is completely fine, I think, for black. And so after a4, I mean, we can just enter those kind of variations with bishop e7, and then we can push b4 and then try to break for c5 quite early on. And then now we're gonna enter the main variation here, which is after e4. So this is definitely the main move because it needs to, I mean, white can gain the space here. I mean, I don't know what to say. I mean, like, this is a very natural move. Similar to the modern Meran with 8 bishop b7, white can also play e4 immediately in response to it. And so here we break with c5. And there's some interesting complications that can occur after d5, which is the Reynold's attack. I'm going to go into this in the next video, I think, or maybe 2 videos from now, because I'm going to talk about the Modern Meran, and only then after that I will talk about the Reynold's attack. Important to note here is that the Reynold's attack can occur after the Old Meran, which is with a6, or in the Modern Meran with bishop b7. So the difference is that with the bishop on b7, the bishop may not support the e6 pawn. So in some variations, we may want to keep the bishop on c8 to defend the e6 pawn. Essentially, I think black is fine in both of the variations. Depends on your on what you prefer and what kind of additional options that you want to allow for white. But here we're going to talk about the main move from this position, which is e5. This leads to crazy play. But I think this is exactly what black is hoping for, and black should hope for. Here we will take on d4, and we'll look at a few non-energetic moves here, which, for example, knight e2, which has been tried a few times, but it's not very challenging. We have the nice d5 square for the knight, and next we will continue with bishop e7, and then possibly play h6 to prevent any Greek gift sacrifices that we could see coming, like takes and then knight g5, and then the queen coming in somehow. It can get somewhat dangerous, so we can just play bishop e7, and play h6 and then castles, possibly. And we can note that if we trade off in this endgame, for example, if the queen was to capture on d4 at some moment, and then we play queen b6, clearly black will have the advantage in the endgame because of the weak e5 pawn. The pawn is quite advanced and can be targeted in the future. So I think this is quite pleasant for black. Knight e4 is interesting here. It's an interesting gambit popularized by Bronstein, but I think black has no problems after the immediate knight e5, and after castles, bishop e7. And for a long time, h6 in this position was chosen to prevent the annoying look in bishop g5, which is quite a typical idea, but bishop b7 actually just shows that bishop g5 is not a serious threat, because bishop g5 just forces the queen to a really nice square on b6, where it defends the d4 pawn perfectly. And for example, rook c1, we play h6, pressing the bishop, bishop h4, and then here knight f4 is recommended by the engines, attacking the bishop on d3 and putting pressure on the long diagonal. And after bishop b1 here, there's a very nice move here, which is the move d3, which disconnects the bishop's defense over the knight. And so white should probably just take there on d3, and this allows a tempo gain with knight c5. And after knight takes c5, bishop takes c5, we have a lot of activity here, and we've restored the material balance. As we see, we have the open d file, the knight on f4 is quite strong. Both bishops are very active. And let's say, for example, bishop g3, looks quite natural. We just take on d3, and after castles, bishop h4, bishop d5, b3, rook fc8. We're preparing to play a5, a4, and also queen a5 to add the pressure onto the queenside pawns. And the bishop on h4 we can see is also quite misplaced. So this bishop g5 move is not very challenging, and so it's not something that black needs to be afraid of. Instead of bishop g5 here, a4 is best, trying to take advantage of the queenside pawns being pushed, overextended, but we can take on a4 here. And here the engine recommends the move bishop e1. Let's say, for example, yeah, white plays a move like rook e1 here, which just played once by Reynold actually. And we have this move knight b4, which gains space while attacking the bishop on d3. And after bishop b1, we can play knight c5 here. We exchange the white centralized knight on e4. And after knight c5, bishop c5, rook takes a4. We play queen b6 here, still defending the pawn, and putting pressure on the diagonal. And let's say after bishop d2, we have a5 here. And if we count the material, black is actually just up a pawn, and also dominates the entire position because, we can see that the knight is glued into the b4 square, and we can play h6 next and possibly castle, or even just keeping the king on e8 is actually quite fine and quite safe there. Let's say, for example, rook a3. In the game, h6 was chosen, but I think after d3, which is a nice move attacking f2 and blocking the bishop on b1, this is a lot easier, I think. We're also preparing to support the pass pawn with bishop a6 next. So, for example, bishop e3, we play bishop a6 with, the pawn survives and white has no compensation for the pawn. So, rook e1 is just kind of shows the danger of ignoring it. So bishop b1 just gets the bishop out of danger, and here we can play a3. We close down the a file, but also if white captures on a3, then we will have access to the c3 square. And this can actually prove to be quite dangerous. After ba3, we have knight c3. We're just threatening to take the bishop now. And so after knight c3, I think queen e1 was recommended by the engine, but if you have to play a move like queen e1, something has gone horribly wrong. But after knight c3, dc3, actually the pawn on c3 survives. Like, we can play rook c8 next, play bishop d5, and then play bishop e7, and the castles with a big advantage. I don't think it's necessary to play h6 in this position, but it can also be useful. But maybe we want to keep the option alive of playing g6. So when the queen comes to d3, then we can play g6 and close the diagonal. So maybe h6 is not good in this position. Just continue with rook c8, bishop d5, bishop e7, and then just castle. This is very nice. Which is why in this position taking on a3 is not advisable, and taking on d4 is best. After that, we will play queen b6, and black allows the trade of queens here because the e5 pawn, as mentioned before, will become weak in the endgame. We will continue next with rook c8, castles, and black has already a very nice position there. Bishop e7 and castles there, so that's quite nice. So this knight e4 move is also not very good. Now we will enter the main bulk of theory, which is after knight takes b5. This is known as the Blumenfeld Variation, and 3 moves have been tried in this position. First off, let's get rid of the not the very good moves, which is knight g4. This line is quite crazy. First off, it attacks the e5 pawn, but I think if white knows what they're doing, at the very end of the long sequence, white will gain an advantage. So I'll just show the variation here with queen a4, bishop e7, knight b takes d4, queen b6, castles, bishop c5, h3, bishop takes f3, h takes g4, bishop d5, knight b3, castles, queen takes d7, bishop takes b3, bishop h7, which is a desperado, king h7, and the queen d3, getting the queen out of harm's way, and then taking back the bishop. And then here, after this long sequence, essentially, I think that white in this line has an advantage here because first off, they're up 2 pawns. Maybe after rook b5, possibly one of the pawns will drop, but still, this is quite a risky position to play, obviously. Which is why I think that. Let me look at knight f3 here. Okay, not so much. Yeah, which I think why knight g4 is not a very good move after queen e4. And there's no serious benefit to why knight g4 would be a better move than the other alternatives like knight e5 or the main move a takes b5. So I don't recommend knight g4 at all. Knight takes e5 here is quite interesting. It's the main alternative to a takes b5, and it's known as the Sozin variation of the Blumenfeld variation. Quite a long name of the Semi-Slav variation of the Queen's Gambit declined. It's kind of funny, but yeah. Knight takes e5 here, and then we take on b5, And here, okay, there are a few options, but because I'm not recommending this, I'm just going to show the main line here after bishop b5 and then bishop d7. Taking on d7 is no good because after this sequence, queen b6, knight takes d4, we get this check and it's quite annoying for white to deal with. Then I come into d3 and a big advantage here. Which is why bishop takes d7 is no good. So knight takes d7, and then we play this move queen a5 check, just winning the bishop on b5. And then in this variation, king f8, the king is quite misplaced, but black is preventing white from castling. And the reason that I don't like this variation is after a4, which is a nice move to try to misplace the queen. We can, I think the best variation here is to take on b2. And after castles, knight e4, queen f3, f5, bishop f4, queen c3, queen h5. White is clearly better here. Black is up a pawn, but clearly it's not worth the king being in such a compromised position. So that's why this knight takes d5 move is not particularly good after knight takes e5, then bishop e5 check, which is not a difficult sequence to find. But here a takes b5, and so this has been chosen by famously by Anand twice against Kramnik, because interestingly Anand and Kramnik are both Semi-Slav players. They have a lot of I remember like one of the games they not in this match, but they had like a crazy theory fest in the Botvinnik variation many years ago, and that was quite exciting. But yeah, two great players. And in this main variation after a takes b5 and e takes f6, we play g takes f6. And the idea, okay, first off, this is like one of the most popular variations of the Meran. Black's pawn structure is damaged on the queen side here with the doubled f pawns, and also on the queen side here with the isolated b5 pawn. And so as a result, the king on e8 is actually quite safe, and it's best not to castle here. And as a result, the g file is opened. Yeah, the a file is also opened, and so black will try to rely on the activity of the pieces to compensate here. For example, an interesting move here was like play rook g8 and then try to bring the rook up the board, which was played by Anand in their match. And here we can play, like, for example, queen b6, bishop b7, knight c5, the king being on e8 still, and there's some interesting theory to be had. First off, let's look at bishop b5, which is no good after queen e5, just winning the bishop. And after knight d4 here, this is actually too greedy, and white should not take this pawn. Queen b6 here, and actually the best move recommended by the engine is bishop e2, but clearly I think, okay, we can just turn on the engine here. Yeah, we can give a bishop b4 check and then force the king to f1. The engine already recommends bishop a6, keeping hold of the pawn, and I think black has a very nice position. The material is actually balanced here, so yeah, the fact that white had to move the king up the board, king over to f1 is already not a good sign. But I just want to show that, for example, if white is too greedy here, knight takes b5, then we can play bishop e7 with the tempo on g2. Let's say bishop f4, there's bishop e4 check, misplacing the king, king f1, knight e5, bishop e2 and king e7, with both rooks coming active here, with either rook hg8 or rook hd8, and then bring the rook to c8 with a very active position. That's not very good for white. And so here the main move by far is just to castle, and black is currently up a pawn here, but okay, we can see queen b6, and the main move here is queen e2, just putting pressure on the b5 pawn. But before that, let's look at bishop e4. I don't think it gives white anything after they move bishop e7, trading the bishops, and then knight takes d4, and then rook g8 here, just putting pressure on the g2 pawn, threatening checkmate in 1. And so f3 here is weakens the the a7 g1 diagonal, so this is not very good. We can play bishop c5 here, threatening e5 already, and so after king h1, knight e5, the pieces jump really to a lot of active places here. Knight b3, bishop b6, queen e2, queen c6, preparing queen c4. Yeah, and after queen c4, we can trade off the pieces. Then the knight being on c4 would be very advantageous, putting pressure on b2, for example. And so bishop e3 here was chosen in the game, but after queen c4, black has clearly a nice control over the position. Queen c4, knight c4, and then we trade on b6, and then we can bring the knight to d5, for example. So that's f3 is quite weakening. But queen f3 here is, I think, the main move. And after we trade off the queens, we play rook g4. Yeah, just activating the rook, preparing the rook to come to the a file if allowed. And so b3 here should be played. But after bishop c5, black is going to be able to play knight b6 to d5. And the bishop is really nice on the a7 to g1 diagonal. This endgame is actually probably slightly preferable for black. The king will come to e7 with no problems. The king is actually quite active in this endgame, so bishop e4 is not too dangerous. We just play bishop e7, trade out the bishops, play rook g8, bishop c5, knight e5, and etc. And so here, after castles, queen b6 and queen e2, a few moves have been tried here. First off, bishop a6. It's a topic of theoretical discussion. I'm not sure about the situation currently, but I think what is still slightly better after rook d1 here, putting pressure on the pawn eventually, after rook d8 and then b4 here. This tries to open up the files on the queen side here, and for example after bishop b4, which is best, rook b1, bishop c3, bishop a3 here. Okay, maybe not bishop a3, maybe bishop b5 is better. But yeah, there should be equality here from this variation. And then quite a crazy sequence here, but with active play this should be quite equal. Yeah, and in this game by Sasakiran Krishnan versus Karyakin, this ended in a draw after good technique by both sides. So yeah. So going back, Lichess is kind of laggy right now, but let's see. So this position is probably just strategically dangerous for black, but objectively with concrete variations this should be equal. Not sure if a4 here is maybe better or not. Trying to just blast open the queen side here, and b takes a4 here is best. After rook a4, bishop e7, rook d4, rook g8, and g3 here. This looks quite dangerous, to be honest, from black, because white pieces are quite active, and there may be some dangers here to be had. For example, on this variation, bishop a6, bishop d3. Okay, maybe yeah, here best, instead of repeating here, is just take the pawn on h7 and then bishop f3, queen f3, and then queen takes d4, bishop g8, and then knight e5 here, queen f6, queen d5. So this is the recommended line by the engine. First off, threatening knight f3, and after f3, bishop e7, queen f4, rook c8, bishop a7, f5, queen d2, and queen b3. This is the best line recommended by the engine, but clearly this is not what black should be going for. I mean, white is up 2 pawns. If you make one slight mistake, then it's going to be over in a second. And so even though the computer says this is equal, this is not a position that I think black is quite happy to enter. So a4 maybe poses black with more of a difficult challenge on move 15 here. So that's the reason bishop a6 is not too good. Bishop b7 is interesting. It was chosen by Anand twice in their against Kramnik in their 2008 World Championship match, and he won both times, because the first time he played like bishop e7, and then for example takes, and then bishop d6 here, preventing bishop f4, because if white is able to get bishop f4 to g3, then maybe the position is quite solid. That was the position that Anand got in the first game, and then in the second game he actually surprised Kramnik by not going for bishop d6 but playing the immediate rook g8, which allows bishop f4 to g3, but eventually black got in like f5, f4, and then swung the rook up to like g4 and stuff like that. It's a very crazy game that you should probably check out, but it's not very sound. Yeah, it's not very sound, so I don't recommend sacrificing the pawn that way. And so b4 here is the main move, bishop f4 here has been tried, and after bishop b7, rook fc1, bishop c5, just hanging on to the pawn, knight d2, preparing bishop e4, play rook g8, threatening the g2 pawn, bishop e4, f5, bishop f3, king e7, And then here, I think black should be quite, yeah, has quite a pleasant advantage here because the king is quite safe on e7 here, and the bishops are quite active. Black is up a pawn. It's not easy to regain this pawn back for white. And in this game played, yeah, I mean, Kismatulan played this from the black side. A4 was chosen, and actually b takes a3 was just winning here. I mean, it's still complicated, but still black is better. Should just take the pawn and then take on f3, play queen c6, h5, and then with queen d5 coming, white cannot take the pawn on h5 because the g2 square is being threatened. So this is I mean, just taking the pawn here should be considered if white plays dubiously. I mean, a4 is a quite interesting idea. Just try to open up the queen side there, but objectively that pawn should be taken. And here rook d1 is the main move, and we should play bishop c5. So we see the bishop c5 move quite often, trying to just defend the d4 pawn. And here bishop f4 can be tried again, but after h5, yeah, trying to push the pawn forward. Rook ac1, king f8. The king actually just gets to safety on g7. And now we see that h5 also prevents the move bishop h6. So after bishop e5, king g7, knight e2. Just want to show a sample line here. It gets quite insane. Bishop g4 here. And bishop g6. Yeah. I don't think this has ever been played, but this is quite interesting. With the d6 pawn being, or actually the d3 pawn being well defended. So on this line, you see that all of the variations are very, very wild. And instead of bishop f4, a4 is interesting, which is the idea that we saw in the previous game, just to open up the queen side here. After b takes a3, b takes a3, we played bishop b7 here. And after rook b1, queen c6, bishop b5, queen d5, bishop b2, rook g8. Again, we see this typical position where black tries to put pressure on the long diagonal while white puts pressure on the d4 pawn and opens up the queen side of the board. And we see this variation of bishop d4 takes, bishop d7, and the king e7 here, because obviously taking with the king we just lose after rook d4. Taking with the queen would dislodge this entire battery, and which would not be good. So king e7, king f1, queen takes d7 now, and then rook takes d4, bishop d5. And now after rook bd1 and king f8, black was completely fine in this game between Richard Heinke and Pavel Danenkov, played in 2010. Yeah. Not sure if it was a correspondence game or not, but that's a very nice example. And I think overall this line, yeah, this line is completely fine for black objectively, although white kind of is the one that forces the direction of play, deciding to play a4 or not, and then black will need to be kind of like, black will kind of need to rely on the activity of the rook on coming to g8 and the bishop coming to b7 and the bishop c5 coming to defend the pawn, playing b4 obviously, and then taking it from there. So this is, yeah, just as a closing statement, this is kind of why this Old Meran variation is quite risky, which I've said in the previous video. It's because of this castles, queen b6 and the queen e2 move, where black should definitely play b4 here. And if they don't play b4 here and then sacrifice the pawn like Anand did with bishop e7, then play will get very, very wild and no one knows what's going on there. So if you want to play a more solid setup, then I suggest looking into the Modern Meran, which I'm going to explain after this video, so in the next video. And yeah, that essentially covers everything that I want to present in this Old Meran variation. We can see the position's quite imbalanced, and there are a lot of lines that you need to know and like the different nuances, but I think that if you do know them, then you should be completely fine. And yeah, I mean, the better prepared person and the person who knows the opening the best will just win the game. So yeah, just do your research and see what you like better. So that's going to be it from me in this video. Thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you want to request any videos or any topics or any openings, I'm open to those suggestions. Still working on one of the videos on the English opening, because I'm not an English opening player myself. It's kind of difficult, but still I'm trying my best on that. So that's going to be it from me. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see everyone in the next video. Please stay safe and have fun playing chess. Bye bye.